Hey everybody, it's Kelly Justice here at the Philosophy Society. It is December 13th, 2023. We are at the Toronto Metropolitan University Library. So today we're going to be talking about epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, or how do we know what we know? And there's two predominant ideas from the early modern period of philosophy. Well, it's focused on a lot in the early modern period, which would be empiricism and rationalism. And empiricism is the idea that our knowledge comes from sense experience. And then rationalism is that it comes through reason. We want to step back from sense experience as the defining characteristic of being empirical or an empirical way of knowing. It's better just to focus on experience. So if we have a person and they are in their world, our sense experience is a very limited understanding of how data comes in. Our mind is also working, and we have certain cognitive filters or ways we look at the world that help us interpret data. There's a lot going on there that we could say that is not just being derived directly from sense experience. Even in the capacity of reason, being reasonable, that still falls within the category of experience. It is the experience of being reasonable. Now, it's not to say that my experience can falsify or show how a logical format is invalid. That's not what we mean by that. It's just that as a human being, we come to know things through experience necessarily, whether it's direct experience or indirectly through a process of reasoning. I'm still having the experience of doing mathematics, even though the conclusions from mathematics are abstracted from the experience in which they're derived. And so it's within this experience that we have to navigate our lives, and we utilize reason to do so, right? We project ourselves, and we have certain, like we said last time, there are values, principles, and we can have certain goals, which the values are directed towards, right? So we have our purpose / goal. But in some ways, how we're conducting ourselves to get to those ends is very important. The goal is like right here, right? And we can reason what our certain goals may be. We may feel some things like I feel uncomfortable, or if I'm like, someone's like drunk and they're vomiting, they're not really thinking, they know that they don't like the suffering that they're currently engaged in. Our reasons can be wrong though. And we also have the problem of bias. And when we talk about the scientific method, one of our principles is falsification through some form of like testing or experimentation or whatever. And that goes back to our experience again, right? We could have some intellectual test or almost thought experiment to derive and show why things might not make sense. But fundamentally, it's still within the realm of experience. And the reason I say that is because it's still subject to our bias, right? So if we just inclusively look at our knowledge as something that is experienced, then we can account for all these other things instead of compartmentalizing and dissociating reason. We can talk about a priori knowledge without experience, and that's fine, but it's still known within experience. Like this truth of a priori truth is independent of any kind of experience. That's the nature of it. But the knower, which is this person, that person has to experience that a priori truth regardless, even though the integrity of its truth is independent of the knower and independent of the knower's experience. It's its own thing. But the knower still has to have access to it. So there could be like a person and all these truths all around the individual, right? These like unknown scientific discoveries. But the individual still needs to have access to it. Like, how do you discover something? And part of that is going to be like, you talk about perception, your awareness of things in your environment occurring. You have to see something happen and then verify that it's real. And then you talk about replication. And so aside from like philosophical knowledge, there's like knowledge of one's life. So there's like philosophical truths. We can call scientific truths. And then we can just like jump all the way down to like personal truths. And the understanding of personal truths in some ways is like what it means to grow as a person, which goes down to the self-reflection or the know thyself principle. These personal truths are things that sometimes we kind of have to know them through our experience. Other people may observe us. You might have like some other here, right? And this person's perceiving you, and they're like a little reason, like a little reasoner in your mind, like Dennett's committee of selves that composes consciousness. And so this little person that says something to you, they observe you objectively because they're not experiencing what you're experiencing, and they say, "Hey, why are you doing this?" What do you say to them? Right? You have to. It's up to you to derive some explanation for what's going on, to make sense of it, to use your reason to explain your experience. And so fundamentally, it's up to you to observe what's going on in your life and make sense of it and discover whatever truths that you can derive. Now, there are a bunch of problems with this. We go back to the bias thing and whatever else. But really, it's like, we can talk about lifestyle, right? Or like life is like an art, almost, like living. Living, there are scientific things that we can know, but you doing it is like almost like a craft. So it's like being I always use the carpenter example because I was a carpenter for a while. Being a carpenter, you can read a textbook, but learning like how to use the hammer, right? Like if I'm using the hammer, there's certain muscles in my arm that if I repeatedly use those in motion, they get really sore, right? And so you may not know that from reading the textbook about being a carpenter, about using a hammer. You just wouldn't know. When you go out there and do it, or when you're like one time I was hammering, I'm standing on top of a ladder, and it was super cold. And I smashed my thumb like 3 times in a row. I was really tired, like fatigued, and it just happened. And I was like, if I hit my finger one more time, I'm gonna fucking break it. Like there's nothing it's just gonna happen. I can feel it. And so knowing when to quit, like when to say that's enough for today, that's important. That's something that you read in the book, right? And so there's a certain practice of living. And there are truths within that practice. And you can like explain them in such a way for them to be reasonable, and you can communicate them so that they are a principle that somebody else can follow that's universal to other humans. And that's kind of what I'm doing, right? Okay, I went to school to learn these things. I understand the science of psychology to some degree. I understand philosophy to some degree. And meaning for me in life is to communicate to other people what these truths would be that would also apply to them. It's not just idiosyncratic to myself. It's not just me talking about my life. It's something that is relevant for everybody. And so we can have these goals in life, right? These things that we project ourselves onto, we reason out. Society can impose them, so the goals can be individual, or they can be social, right? And there's like a mix of both. It's not just one or the other, right? And so this goal, maybe more social than individual. Like maybe other people want you to do this, or you're just doing this job because you make money and that's just what the economy is paying people to do, And we have a bunch of robots doing stuff for us. It might not be the case that you have to do that anymore. You're doing this goal, but in your experience, there's information within your being, different selves that come to expression that indicate to you that this may or may not be the right thing for you to be doing. And like recently, someone offered me a job, and I thought about it. I was like, yeah, I could use money. It's like something I could do. But the way I felt was just like dread and depression. And if I disregard that, if I say I am not going to listen to how I feel here, then it's going to have, that feeling is not really going to, and maybe it'll go away. And that's where you can go back to our principles within the scientific method, and we can falsify that, but it most likely is the case that feeling is just going to grow and expand. It's like a seed, you know what I mean? But it's important to try it out. Sometimes though, we can talk about intuition, how intuitive you are with yourself. You can say, is it really necessary for me to explore this at all? In our experience, one other, so where are we going? So one thing we can talk about is like love, right? And some people, so the other might say, what are you doing? Why do you love this person? Why do you put yourself through this? And you may think things to yourself. You're like, well, there's some things that are good and there's some things that are bad. We do a little cost benefit here. And you can tick off all the things that are good and bad. But that is a different part of your brain, right? That's your prefrontal cortex right here. That's not the limbic system. There are things within your experience, there are things about people that the mind, that part of our evolutionary lineage may not comprehend fully. There may be something that your instincts are telling you, and the other part of your brain is saying, hey, whoa, watch out, this isn't good for you, And we got to kind of put them both together. But fundamentally, it's your experience and learning how to navigate the feelings that come to you and the emotions that are within those feelings. What is the awareness of those emotions? And what is the object of the emotion, the thing that is making you feel the way that you are? When you're on your trajectory in life, you want to be able to be in touch with yourself in your experience such that you can navigate yourself without even really having to rely on anybody else. Like you may have an instance of something that occurs to you and needs social support, right? There's moments where talking to other people is important. But at the end of the day, no one can tell you what to do. You have to figure out what to do for yourself. Other people, again, will look as the other and say, oh, why are you doing this? This doesn't make sense to them. Why? Because they don't have the feeling, right? And that feeling is what motivates you. They may be motivated. They may have a feeling because they see you in distress, or they can see great potential in you. They want things for you. They want you to have money and be successful. And so they have feelings from that perception, but they can't necessarily experience the same feelings as you. Like you can have empathy, which is important. Yeah. There are limitations to empathy, but in our personal relationships, it's important to be empathetic, understand each other, understand why we do things, so that you can have a rich, quality relationship with somebody. So what we're looking at is this navigation through life, right? This practice of living. What we're saying is navigation. And part of it is we have these goals, okay? And you can have super aspirational goals. Like I mentioned before, I'm a vocalist, right? So it's like, oh, you want to be a rock star. And people say, oh, it's unattainable. It's like, it's possible, but unlikely. You know what I mean? And so, well, if you're going to map this out, what does it really mean? Like, if you're going to be empirical, so one thing about being empirical, right, is our experience. And the other thing is like this notion of like positivism, or just looking at what exists, So if what do we mean by being empirical? What is the case? Or another way of saying is, what exists? And we want to it's like applying Occam's razor, right? Not making assumptions. Assumptions is different than like a bias or like an optical illusion, Like an assumption is, when I use the term assumption, the meaning in this use would be that the way in which I reason things to myself, or the things that I believe, there's something that I believe that I don't have evidence for, right? It's something that I'm kind of just that I accept is true, but it has not been proven. And it can lead to other flaws in reasoning. When I say what is the case, what exists, being empirical, we talk about this practice of living thing, right? This goes down to like, we're always kind of talking about eudaimonia or living well. What does it mean to live well? We talked about the wellness part, I think, a little bit. Talked about emotions and these other kinds of things. But what about the living part? What does it mean to live, right? Well, Kant talks about time, and time is a big factor. Time is something that is kind of always permeating our experience, right? We have the 24-hour day, for example. So we have like our sleep, and then we have our activities, and then we just repeat basically. And yeah, there's a whole bunch of things we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, we can go into like the sleep, work, play, like separation of our time. But really what I want to focus on is we kind of have to break down living through some kind of a time-based like scale, right? Like we have to kind of look at it and say, there is only so much time. And being human means that I have to distribute my time evenly. So that's one thing. Another thing goes down to this habit context here, okay? The habit context is that as, you know, so it goes back to the living thing. So when we talk about living, right, there's the cosmos. That's like the grandest category. And then there's humans, okay? Now the cosmos, that's where time is that it's better to step back and make it a bit more broader or inclusive and just talk about experience in general. We have the person here, and there's what they experience. And they may reason things, right? But the problem with that is that we can be biased. Sometimes our reasonings can just be incorrect. And not to say that what we experience is always true. Sometimes we see things that aren't really there. But to know anything, there must be a knower, right? And even if I have some a priori truth, something that is true, whether or not I experience it, like 1 + 1 = 2 is true, whether or not I see two things in front of me and I add them together. The knower still has to go through the experience of addition, even though the sum or the conclusion of that thing that is known is true independent of the knower. For the knower to know it, they have to experience that reason that they're thinking about. There may be certain truths in the cosmos, but you have to discover them, right? Like the James Webb Telescope recently was falsifying the theory of the Big Bang, that our current calculations are not as accurate as some of the data that the James Webb Telescope got. And so that data is like a truth out there, but we just need to have access to it, right? And so that's where we get like the scientific method, is that we have some ideas, and to refine the quality of whatever ideas we have, we test them and falsify them. And so when we talk about our experience in general, you're gonna like there's certain things that you know within your experience. And so last week we talked about values, principles, and habits, and there are certain truths. So within the values, principles, and habits, we can have specific goals, right? And in your experience, you're directed towards these goals, and the values, principles, and habits kind of help you get there. And the goals can be individual goals, and they can also be like social goals. Like people want you to do stuff. Like society wants you to like get this job, and you're going to do it not because you want to, because you're going to make money. And so within the truths that exist, there's philosophical truths or scientific truths. There's like these personal truths, which are kind of like lifestyle things that you learn along the way that are true. Like when you do them, like certain people have dietary restrictions, and a doctor may have not had to explain it scientifically and do tests. They may have just discovered it on their own, and it was true. right? Or so living in some ways, these personal could be like an art form almost. It's like the way you're doing it is almost artistic, and then it makes you happy. You're good, you feel good about that, and you kind of know it. Or it's like a craft. The same way as I give the example of the carpenter learning to build things through doing it, you learning to be your best self is almost like a craft. You kind of master the self, right? And so we get the self-mastery thing from this. Like you are the one that has to learn to be you. Nobody else is going to do that. That's your responsibility. And so these personal truths is another way of just saying that's what growth really is. That's what it means to grow up or grow in general. Grow out. Doesn't have to always be up. It can just be like you're becoming. And part of that is like the self-reflection thing. Like I'm aware of myself and what's happened in the past. And this is what's going on, and I'm going to grow from it. But it's also the self-awareness, just knowing this thyself, right? And so other people may observe you, and they may not derive the same truths that you do. Like you're in your experience, and you may feel things within that experience. And those feelings are really the motivation for you to do those goals and stuff. But other people, they don't have the same feelings as you. They may observe you, and they care about you. They want you to do well. They have feelings because of what they observe. But they may not understand why you do the things you do. So why did you do that? Why are you doing this? And then you have to use your reason and be like, this is why I'm doing it, and make sense of it, right? There's a practice of living, understanding your feelings, and then learning to live with them and navigate life in such a way that you understand them and that you make decisions based on what is good for you and other people. And there's going to be truths along the way. And so one of the things that other people may not understand is like, why do you love that person? Speaking like a recent experience of mine. Why do you love this person? And you can use your reason. You can say, well, these are the reasons why. And you do like a cost benefit. You're like, I love these things and I fucking hate these things. But that doesn't really touch or represent the feeling that you have. The feeling that you have is a different part of the brain. These reasons is the prefrontal cortex, and that love stuff is going down to like the limbic system area, right? And so there's certain instincts that we may have for other people that we can explain as love, but it's not something that's limited to any specific thing. It goes beyond that. And that can lead you into very destructive, unhealthy relationships. And we need to have a balance between observing things and saying no or yes, right? And we go back to like this sense of being empirical, right? Or empiricism. And so what do we mean when we say empirical, right? We can't just say experience, because people may experience things, again, that aren't really there, like an optical illusion, like the rainbow. So when we say empirical, we're trying to say like, what is the case? Or what exists? Another way of saying it is like, we're going to apply the principle of Occam's razor, right? Which was simplicity in the scientific method, which is not making assumptions. And so not making assumptions in this context is about reason, but we don't and so we don't want to impose a rational structure on living well, which is the eudaimonia thing that we're always kind of talking about. We don't want to impose this rational structure when we can just look at what's really there. Like, what is there? What is? And then from that, build something on what really exists. So when we talk living well, we've talked about the wellness part. I'm reiterating what I said earlier for you, my friend, and for everybody else that will watch this in the future. The wellness part is like the mental health part. And we went through that, emotions and these kinds of things. But the living part, what does that really mean? The living part, living well. And so living happens fundamentally within the context of the cosmos. And there's this property of time that is relatively cosmological. And humans are subject to that. We have to deal with time. Time doesn't deal with us, we deal with it. Right? And so we're looking at what does it mean to live. And so we have this 24-hour day thing that we have to figure out, right? And there's sleep and then basically activity, and it repeats itself. Okay, now I've caught up. Now that's where we're at. And so what we're looking at is when you're progressing towards these goals, right, you're doing it through the medium of living, obviously. And the reason part is like the goal thing, okay? But the living part is your experience. And so you can have certain goals as long as they're coherent and they make sense and they are actually achievable, right? How you get there is fundamentally important. And when you what do you mean when you say that? It's like, well, we have to determine what we're doing with our day, right? Because at the I'm gonna be repeating or be circular here. Fundamentally, you're human, and there's certain things that are going to be very important for you to do, and your effectiveness in life will dramatically increase, specifically because you are paying attention to what makes a human being, I don't know, live well, I guess. I'm repeating myself here. What I mean to say is that under the context of living, humans, they need sleep, right? They need to eat. There's certain specific things that are necessary for their existence. And so those things, like when you ask yourself, what's wrong with me? You know, I don't feel good, or if you've solved the problem of values, principles, and you have habits to fulfill those things, there's certain habits that are universal to being human. And those things a lot of the times will dramatically change the course of your life, right? Like, you don't have to look too far to find out where improvement is. It's usually right here. Another way to say it is like, you know, you can climb to the top of Mount Everest to like escape your problems and then get scared of your shadow and fall down the mountain, you know, like it follows you everywhere. And like, so part of it is like the awareness thing, right? The know thyself. So I can try to increase the capacity of my awareness by focusing on my well-being. But then I would have to spend some time doing my meditation or being objective through my other forms of self-awareness, like communicating with people, to understand really what is. We go back to that. The what is thing. And if you don't know what is, then you can't really do anything about what actually exists. And you're kind of fucked, right? Like you may think, so we talked before about opportunity cost. Someone that might be diagnosed with cancer chooses not to go to chemotherapy, and instead they go, you know, to a psychic for 6 months and then they die. Whereas if they went and did the chemotherapy, let's say it was 100% treatable, you know, or your appendix bursts, and you're like, no, I'm just going to go to my Reiki therapist and they're going to take care of my appendix. That's not going to help you, right? We want to, that's where science is useful, right? But in our experience, we want to focus on what is really going on, right? And so the time factor is one thing. Another thing is like the social factor, right? And that's just really like saying, who is in my life? And that goes back to like the love, either benefit or problem. And when you consistently have, so, okay, there's like the day, and let's say you sleep this much. So that's your sleep time. And then so the social factor, if you have a person in your life that directly or indirectly comes in multiple times a day and affects you, all of the dissonance or negative emotions that are created from that interaction, even your attention being taken away from your own growth, that in itself becomes like a problem of living, right? Not having a means to integrate the existence of the other in a harmonious way. And that's one of the ways that you could arbitrate how close do I, or how much time do I spend with this person? If I interact with this person and there's no growth in that interaction, that's a reason to remove yourself from that relationship, right? And so the social factor, it occurs within time. It's very important. to be aware of that, right? Because it's not just your habits. Like this stuff is all you, you know? But the other, this person right here, this person, like we really affect each other. And it's important to be mindful of how we cultivate our social environment. You may impose a reason and have a boundary to this relationship. Say, I will not speak to this person anymore. But fundamentally, your experience is going to kick in again. And it's important, there may be some learning there for you, right? And you might get to a threshold, a breaking point. Like you have these things and then it breaches threshold. And if you breach threshold, that just means there's no more going back. You're done with this now. The learning has stopped. There's so much damage, or it is, the relationship is compromising your identity so much so that you if you don't disengage, you will not be the same person anymore. And so some people, maybe it's a growth thing and it is a good thing to continue going. And otherwise it could be destructive and it could be very harmful to you and your life, right? So fundamentally, we want to look at our sense of knowing ourselves. Because when we talk about knowledge and we talk about the know thyself property, well, what do we mean by that? Right? Like how scientific is know thyself? Know thyself is a different kind of knowledge in some ways. It's more like the art, lifestyle, and craft of living. Yeah. A little study party next door. And it's important to have a sense of ourselves. Now, this is where things like journaling or like making an observational report. So on the website, I have a chapter called the Reflective Mind Map. And that's really just a method of observational reporting on yourself. And really what you're doing is you're asking, what is the case in the context of know thyself? What is the case of myself? And really what you mean by that is again, what is the case of my experience is another thing. We can include other people in that as well. And when you're doing that, you're also trying to remove bias. So if I am engaged in some form of journaling in my observational report, I can go, it's important to go back and read it when you're not in the same state of mind. Because if you're writing when you're upset, you can have very loaded terminology that is removing what is actually the case, and it's just an emotional bias, right? Like if I say this person's an asshole, it doesn't really tell me what's going on. It just tells me I was upset with them, or they did something that I perceived to hurt me. It's important to be empirical about ourselves and our experience so that we can learn from a phenomenological, subjective way. And that's really what we're going to do in the context of knowing ourselves. It's not like again, it goes back to that. It doesn't make sense to say there's like a science of knowing yourself. There's like a lifestyle of knowing yourself. And so how do we do this? Part of it is as you go through your days, so this is like my day cycle here, right? And I have my sleep time, and there's my awake time. These days happen over and over and over again. So if on this day you have like a certain state, you have like mood 1, you want to go back and engage in awareness when the mood changes. And you want to take different perspectives on the self. And this is one reason why people do psychedelics, right? And have an awareness of the same property in the cosmos, but from a different perspective. And that will increase your awareness of whatever is, right? Because it might look like something from this angle. And so to rule out bias, I step over here and I look at it from this angle and I measure it again. And then to rule out further bias, I step on this side and I look at it again. So you're kind of triangulating whatever it is. So if I have a point, I measure it from here, and I measure it from here, and I measure it from here. And then that way I have a better understanding of where it is. And that almost like makes it like a 1D object, 2D, and then 3D, you know? Because you could look at this as like a three-dimensional polygon from top down. And so it's important to have a sense of self. And to do that, it's not just imposing a rational view. Like, for example, if you look at Freud or Jung, these two people, they're not us. They're technically the other. And so they are saying things about our experience that may or may not be true. And it's up to us to determine the integrity of that truth. And how do we do that? Well, we have to go through the falsification method. We have to look at the coherence of what they're saying. We have to test it out by saying, what is the case? And so we may be able to find some kernels of truth in what Freud says, like with the id and the ego and the superego, but it may not accurately describe our experience or the nature of the self, right? Like the Oedipus complex. Like, it's just, maybe for some people it's the case, but not necessarily everybody. Or as psychosocial stages of development. It just might not be the case if people go through a phallic stage, for example. And so, or stuck in a phallic stage, or an oral fixation, whatever it is. And so, we want to be able to have a sense of self, or a sense of ruling out or determining what the truth is, what is known in our experience, because that is like the reality we stand on. That is the thing that you're using to step forward to your goal. It's what you're stepping with. And that is the knowledge of yourself. And if you don't really know yourself, then you can't live as yourself, right? You're living as somebody else, or whatever someone else told you. And so it's important for you to figure these things out, because life is going to change, and you're going to change. And you're going to be challenged with situations that are very, very difficult. And it's important to navigate through them. And you can't be reliant or dependent on other people. You have to become a master of your own self, just so that no matter what happens, you can take care of it. And fundamentally, that's almost what it means to be an adult, right? Like a healthy adult. If you haven't really developed that sense of mastery, then it makes sense that you can feel like anxiety, or just dissociate yourself and be apathetic. And neither of those are good, right? Or feel crushed by your experience and then become depressed. And so there's a way to do this, and it just you have to start every day. And then over time, as you have all of these days connected together and you start mapping out properties, it starts to make sense of this fluid experience that we're in. And so as a mental health counselor, I'm kind of trying to be the other and be aware of that with somebody, and then teach them the skills to do it on their own. And then for the Philosophy Society, it's just being able to talk about these things. And then as a philosophy like community, or the community of the Philosophy Society, we would just do it for each other. When someone's dealing with something, we can talk about those experiences and their feelings, and like what's going on through their day. And really what you're doing is you're just taking the principles of mental health and you're applying it in a community setting, which means that the people that are participating in it are going to be healthier, because we're just focusing on what's real, right? And not telling people things that just might not actually do anything. Yeah, I think that's pretty good for today. So self-mastery is the end goal of today's discussion.